Good morning and welcome. I'm seeing folks enter the room, and we're going to let that happen for just a second before we introduce today's session and introduce our panels. Thanks so much for all of you who registered to sign up and learn from us and with us today. My name is Jason Breifel. I'm the editor-in-chief of Fed Manager and Fed Agent, and I'm a non-attorney partner and the director of government and public affairs at Shaw Bransford and Roth. And we're so thrilled to bring this Ask the Experts webinar to you today. I know it's going to be dynamic, informative, hopefully leave you with some great ideas, maybe some new questions as well. We've got over 350 people signed up for this event, and a lot of you submitted your questions in advance. Thank you for that. That really helped us. We used those questions to identify key topic areas that are of interest to all of you, and then developed the questions that we're going to ask our expert panel here today. So here's how today is going to work. We've got about 40 minutes of time for question and answer with our expert panel. And then we're going to reserve the last 15 to 20 minutes or so for your audience questions. So as we go through today's session, please, I encourage you to use the chat tab. Please also use the Q&A tab to submit your questions. We'll be monitoring that throughout, and we will get to that again at the end of today's webinar. And I'm sure we might not have a chance to get to everything, but we did want to give a chance to balance our approach so that we brought as much as we can to answer the burning questions that you all have. So again, thanks so much for being with Fed Manager this morning. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our expert panel for today. Mika Cross is a strategic advisor and innovative workplace transformation strategist who's a recognized expert on interdisciplinary flexible workforce management with over 20 years experience across government and industry. Mika also recently testified in front of Congress on these issues. Mika, thanks so much for being here with us, and thanks so much as well for helping me put together today's program.
Jason.
Next, Kate Lister. Kate is the president at Global Workplace Analytics, a research-based consulting firm that's been helping organizations and communities develop, execute, and optimize their workplace, workforce, and work practice strategy for almost 2 decades. I first heard Kate 12 years ago when she was testifying before Congress on implementing the 2010 telework law. Kate, thanks so much for being with us.
Great to be here.
And last but certainly not least, we've got Jeff Vargas. Jeff is the president and CEO of Generationology, a future of work and leadership development company and consulting firm focused on optimizing how 5 generations best work together. Jeff is also a former federal agency chief learning officer. Jeff, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Jason. Excited to be here.
All right, so we're about to dive into the conversation, but before we do that, we have 2 quick polls that we're going to ask all of you in the audience to understand your perspective on these topics. That'll just help us understand where you're coming at and where you're coming from as we dive into today's conversation. Can we launch the first poll, please? Oh, you can do them both at once, even better. So the first question is, where is your office today? Are you working at home? Are you somewhere in the middle? Maybe you're splitting your time today, or are you in at the office? And what's your dream workspace? You love working at home, you're in that hybrid approach, or do you prefer to be in the office? Please just take a second to let us know your perspective there. That'll help us understand where our audience is and where you're coming from today. We'll give that about 10 more seconds.
I dropped my answers in the chat, Jason.
Great. Yes. And you can also drop stuff in the chat because apparently hosts and panelists are not allowed to vote. Great. Well, hopefully everyone has had a chance to drop their preferences in the poll. Can we share the results of the poll, please? Let's see. All right. a pretty good spread. We've got 46% of folks virtual today, 24% of folks in the office. It is Wednesday after all, and 31% hybrid. Pretty similar split on the dream workplace side. We've got more than half, 52%, who are in that hybrid, prefer that hybrid approach. 9% like the office, and 39% prefer to be working at home. Oh, Annette, love that. Dream not to work. Don't we all? That's why we kind of, that's why we got to do it hard and get to that retirement phase. But thanks again just for participating in that poll and letting us know where you're at. And I think that probably reflects the state of things in the world today. Kate, we're going to throw the first question to you and ask you, what is the lay of the land in the big picture in terms of workforce flexibility globally right now? What does the research say in terms of preferences of employees, and what are big companies doing or big governments doing?
Yeah, Jason, what's interesting about the numbers, and I've been studying this for almost 20 years, is that they haven't changed a whole lot. So 80 to 90% of employees say they would like to work from home at least some of the time. That has not changed in at least 10 years, right, Mika? According to the Society for Human Resource Management, 63% of organizations offer workplace flexibility to at least to some or all of their employees. No, most or all. And that's very different. That was 6% prior to the pandemic. According to Stanford, and I think they've got the most robust set of data right now in the private sector, 22% of employees who are able to work remotely work from home, are fully remote, 43% are hybrid, and 35% are fully in the office. Very different in the government. Government is 18% fully remote, 23% hybrid, and 59% fully in the office. So a lot more in office. The fully in office in the private sector has not changed since about October of 2022. So we've just seen that flat line in spite of the headlines, in spite of everything that we hear. It really hasn't changed. And globally, we're about even with Latin America. We are working more from home than in Europe and in APAC. For a whole lot of reasons. In terms of how often, we're at about 2.4 days a week for those who do, which is the exact same that it has been for about 15 years for those who have. Of course, there's more people doing it. And the managers want them in the office 3 to 4 days a week, hybrid, 3 to 5 days a week, and employees want to be at home 3 to 4, 5 days a week. But we're really close. I mean, we're closer than we've ever been. We're within a half a percentage point of what people want and what they're actually doing. Where we're not close is there's a lot of people still fully in the office that would like to be, and I think we saw that reflected in your numbers, that would like to be working remotely. And there's more people that would like to work remotely full time than are allowed. So just a few more interesting things about it. Only about 10% of organizations offer full autonomy. Just do what you want, work wherever you want, work whenever you want.
Right.
About a third that decision's made at the company level, and about the other half it's made at the team level. And as far as I'm concerned, that's where it has to be. The big picture, the corporate, the leaders should set up fences, not walls. And then the detailed how we work together should happen at the team level. The biggest concern in management is people are less productive, we're less innovative, our culture is suffering, and our engagement is down. I hear that all the time. I have not talked to one CEO that has evidence of that. And I could go on for an hour with the research on how that's not true. And it's not to say there's nothing to worry about in hybrid work. There's lots to worry about, but organizations are worrying about the wrong things.
Yeah, no, love that, Kate. So much to unpack there. And I think your last point These are kind of more fundamental management challenges. And
Exactly.
we're going to get into that some more. But Mika and Jeff, I wanted to bring you in on this question and maybe we'll start with you, Mika. We've heard from Kate that we've kind of been in the same place for a long time, but the conversation's evolving in some ways, but it's not evolving in other ways. What are you seeing, in the public sector domain, particularly around workplace flexibility and conversations you're having with people and agencies?
Yeah, well, I'll start with the data too, just like Kate. So, in the federal government workspace, you all who took the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey at the height of the pandemic in 2020 indicated that you jumped from only 2% of all federal government employment positions being remote and working remotely to close to half of federal employees were working at some point during that year from a remote capacity. So it jumped quite a bit. And as compared to our civilian counterparts, before the pandemic, the federal government was lagging, as Kate mentioned. So there was only about 2% of our positions, federal government wide, that ever were eligible for fully remote, as compared to about 5% of knowledge workers, according to the American Community Survey. That's before the pandemic. So you might be wondering, well, what were the impacts to the way that we were working during the height of the pandemic and during a time where we had increased telework, increased flexibilities, and increased remote work? So indicators from the FEVs showed that the global engagement scores in really key areas like satisfaction with leadership, global engagement overall, ability to perform our mission were the highest in like 5 or 6 years during the height of the pandemic. And federal friends were telling us that they were experiencing about 50% more workload during the height of the pandemic at a time where they were leaning into more flexible work options, but their satisfaction ratings were even higher. And when you look at other indicators that can impact like outcomes, performance, and productivity, like, let's say psychological safety and how federal workers were experiencing the work environment and culture during that time, indicators show that there are areas in the FEVs that are anchored around the fundamentals of psychologically safe cultures. Those were higher levels, commensurate with higher levels of, I'm going to say, flexibility at large. Because don't get it twisted, 70% of our positions will never be eligible for a lot of telework or fully remote at all. So we've got to get this right from a mindset perspective in terms of building culture and capacity to manage, to be accessible, to be responsive to our customers and our mission, to show up for one another, regardless of location. And so I think, federal agencies are really struggling with that. Like, how do we create this opportunity for meaningful in-person work? What does that mean? How to create space for collaboration, connection, regardless of location? And how do we build equitable, inclusive workplaces where people can feel like they're able to be assessed by the quality of their work, regardless of where, when, or how they're getting their work done, while still being accountable to the things that we have to as career civil servants?
Yeah, thanks, Mika. And I think you made a really important point that I don't want to gloss over, and that's we've got to be honest that half of the federal workforce, or a little bit more, so over 1 million people, have to show up at their duty station. They're at a VA hospital. They're working on a military base. They're in a skiff somewhere. They're a law enforcement person on the front lines. There are a
That's
lot
right.
of jobs that require presence.
That's right.
But and that's part of the challenge that agencies are getting into when that comes to equity. Well, we're not
And
treating everyone perfectly the same, and that
one
becomes a
thing
problem.
one thing, Jason, I want to mention and just add on to that before you jump to Jeff is that, our frontline workers, the people that are in office all the time, co-located together, they ain't doing so well either, okay? When it comes to well-being, engagement, productivity. So if we're pointing the finger at location as an indicator to success, we're looking at the wrong metric.
Exactly. The number's about 40% in the private sector that can't work remotely. Just aren't in a job that allows it. But we before the pandemic, we would have been talking about a palette of flexibility, with remote, hybrid being one part of it. But there's all different kinds of flexibility, and everybody should have access to something.
Right. And I know some of the conversation for those workers who have to show up whether they're shift workers or whatever is, can you give them choice in when that shift happens? Or you can figure out better ways to accommodate people who have childcare needs, especially if you're working a shift in the middle of the night where, say you're a law enforcement person out in the middle of nowhere, there's no facilities to help you out. These are meaningful challenges on the ground that affect folks. Um, Jeff, I want to pull you in. You can talk about some of the things that we've already touched on, but to me, a big issue here is how culture and managers. People have been brought up, they have experiences through their career, and then they're in charge. And then the world has been changing, but you know, people are hard to change at the individual level. So what's the role of managers in this specifically? And I'm curious about your perspective on some of the kind of cultural and generational differences that play out and make this conversation even messier than it already might be.
Well, I think both Kate and Mika sort of led us down the right road. When we talk about togetherness and inclusion, cohesiveness, that has to be where the conversation begins. And it has to be linked to psychological safety. Now, each of the 5 generations, by the way, again, stats and data, the federal government is the last bastion in our country that has 5 generations still working in the workplace. If you look more in the private sector, you're going to see that there's, obviously a significant amount of Gen Z that are coming into the house, millennials and Gen X, and more of a spattering of baby boomers and 1 or 2 traditionalists, so to speak. But in the federal government, we are still predominantly at the leadership level. And I invite people to go do their dance on Fed Scope. The cadre of the SES continues to be and has been at the baby boom level. And so what does that actually look like? And why is that so important when we talk about managing and leading, particularly in these kinds of environment? The federal government was built and continues to run on a baby boom model, which looks like those who are most productive get in early and go home late, right? They share a workspace where I have line of sight. But the reality is, and as Kate and Mika have, graciously pointed out, we're in a different place. And the stats just don't bear that way of engagement is the most salient. So what does that really mean if we're going to be successful going forward? First and foremost, and Mika started to allude to it, is managers and leaders got to focus on psychological safety in their organization, with a recognition that there are 3 separate corporate cultures taking place in this thing we call work. So what does psychological safety look like? In person, hybrid, and remote. And of particular note, because it's all a stare, Dr. Clark is a researcher on there, but the first there is inclusion safety. And with respect to that, and gets to the crux of it, we got to practice what's called collaborative equity. So Google did a thing, 2020, 2021, looked at their workforce, thought they're really smart people that collaborated well together, and they recognized that was not the case. And in federal agencies, collaborative equity looks like, whether you're remote or hybrid, there's clarity about the norms when it comes to representation equity. I'm in a hybrid meeting, I'm in the conference room, you're at home. Presentation equity, the ability for people to present. And then here's the big one, information equity. Is everybody getting the same information at the same time? And what we haven't done yet in the government, we haven't done a good job of yet, is saying to supervisors and managers, haven't codified it in 5 CFR 410 and 412, my former world, right? How do we train people who are leaders to be effective managing in these 3 environments, recognizing that some of the high points they have to connect with is collaborative equity? What's their collaborative equity plan and how do they execute it? Because at the end of the day, we know that vision without resources is hallucination.
Love it. Thanks,
Martha
Jeff. Yeah,
Johnson,
Kate, come on in. Yeah.
who was head of the USGSA more than a decade ago, I guess, and was part of a big experiment with remote work. She gave up her gigantic office and went out and worked, right in the middle of everybody else. But she had a line that I absolutely love. Telework doesn't create management problems, it reveals them. And one of the big things it reveals is what Jeff was just talking about. Managers aren't trained to manage remote people. We did a study earlier this year, and it showed that 75% of managers have not been trained to manage remote workers. 75% of employees have not been trained in best practices. It's not their fault. We sort of fell into this and we were in triage mode for what, 2 years, maybe 3 years. And we never really changed the practices and the processes. So we're sort of at the point right now where, when you first got a cell phone, you only used it in a house. We haven't changed how we're doing things. And the management training is absolutely at the core of this.
Yeah, and I think that that's just sad. Um, it's so sad. We passed this law in 2010, which
Is that
created this flexibility and enabled continuity of operations, but it truly has been left to individual agencies to figure out whether they want to and can figure out how to justify investment in their management capacity and capability. It just
Which
hasn't
needs to be
happened.
done regardless of where people work.
Right. And this is a diversion, but it also isn't. There's big conversations as we're not going to talk about the election, but there are big conversations about the future of the federal workforce, how they are performing, how accountable or not they are, if they're doing their jobs or not, and if it should be easier to fire or discipline them. Some of this
Mm.
is the whole Schedule F conversation, but some of that is informed more generally by concerns and by lawmakers and the public about, is the government performing? Are people working? And if we're not investing in our managers, the people who drive employee engagement, who drive performance and productivity of our employees, we're really missing a key part of the equation based on Gallup research and others that says that that person is really key. These are a cadre of employees that, in my opinion, the government has abandoned almost forever. I see
And to
Mika
that end,
come in on this.
well, to that end, Jason, the focus has to be on the second quadrant of psychological safety, which is learner safety. We got to normalize a culture where we do talk about our mistakes and we promote more curiosity. And we have to recognize that we got to do a better job of onboarding a supervisor or manager to working in these three cultures. And then we also got to exercise the term we use in our company called reboarding, right? So you may not have gone through all the bells and whistles of the latest onboarding activity. That should not mean that you're left out of learning what they are, onboarding to the technology, but really about the engagement. How do I engage through 5 different generations online in a remote capacity where people feel seen, they feel heard, and they feel valued? And we've got to give managers and supervisors the opportunity to walk down a path where they can grow to an exceptional level of success. Right now, we say, wonderful, reward for good work is more work. And you're going to get to be a supervisor and earn no more money. And maybe you'll go to training that's effective. Everybody happy? Let's move on. That's not fair to the organization. It's fair to the managers and frankly, fair to the people.
Here's what I do know, Jeff, too, is that changing the location of where you work is not going to be a magic wand that magically changes engagement and culture and connection and performance and the ability for us to create efficiencies in the way that we work. And it's certainly not going to enhance well-being alone without the skill sets. Jason, you asked about government at large. I'm going to bring in some best practices from local and state and municipality governments too, by the way, who actually were just surveyed by the Public Sector HR Association in this past summer, and found that the majority of them are working in a hybrid environment. So Kate, that's good news. Remember, I asked you for some data, and I actually looked at your data points and pulled this survey data too, which looked at like a couple thousand public sector local government workers. what they also found was this interesting shift to more 4-day-a-week work weeks and higher usage of flexible work schedules and alternate work schedules. Because a lot of those other public sector organizations are similar to the federal government in that they have a lot of public facing positions that just simply can't be done fully remotely. Here's another thing though. People are adverse to not thinking differently about the workplace in all kinds of ways. I mean, decades ago in the intelligence community, we were building part-time employment, job sharing, even, think about reemployee annuitant programs that are underutilized, alternate work schedules, compressed work schedules. The majority of folks are not on 410s or 549s or part-time employments, even though we have the policies to allow it, because managers don't understand how to manage a multi-generational, modern, flexible, at large workplace. And it's not their fault. To your points, we haven't invested in the right kinds of training and skill sets. Also, how do we create a change in the mindsets? Because GAO and OPM, year after year after year, in all their congressional reports, cite management resistance as the #1 factor to why telework hasn't been successful over the past couple of decades since Kate and I have been collaborating and co-conspirating in this space. And so when we're thinking about what does that mean to the taxpayer, we're not going to get much greater outcomes in terms of performance and productivity. We'll get management by butts and chairs. And I saw somebody had a comment in the chat about, managers seeing people. And is that like the de facto way that they understand that people are working? And there was an experiment back in the day, you can Google it, it was called the Hawthorne effect. And it was based out of the industrial age where like factory workers were made to come into a place and managers felt like they could manage them better because they could actually see them. But how many times have we like not had enough work maybe, or maybe too much work and not the right tools and technology to make it efficient for us to do our jobs better? So there are some real systemic changes that need to happen, or we are not going to be successful for the future of the next generation of workers and the future of federal work at large.
Yeah, a presence has never been a proxy for productivity. The highest shopping time, Amazon shopping time is during working hours. This is from before the pandemic. So what does that really tell you? If we don't get to managing by results, then we're never going to get equity. We're never going to get safety. It's so depressing to see somebody else get promoted or get the same compensation that you get that isn't doing their job. And that we've just got to be measuring people by results. It's not the manager's fault. I've seen some stuff in the chat. They weren't trained to be managers at all. They were typically doers that got promoted into some new position. But it's funny, the government has, if you think of Maslow's hierarchy, autonomy, mastery, purpose, they're at the top of the pyramid. The government has that, right? People are working there because they believe in it. They have a sense of purpose. What it's missing is the stuff at the bottom, the safety stuff that Jeff was talking about. Being heard, being included, feeling psychologically safe, having the right meeting room technology so that you can meet effectively with a hybrid team. These are just fundamentals.
Yeah, no, I love those perspective. And Kate, I'm curious, in terms of manager development, support, etc., are there any companies that are really doing this well, or does industry consider or view this differently than government, or are we in more or less the same boat as it
I
relates
think
to
we're more similar than we are dissimilar. I've worked with government agencies too, and you've got many of the same issues. You've got some other issues in terms of what comes down from above, but so does the private sector. The Amazon says everybody has to be back to the office. Well, maybe they will be, maybe they won't. Maybe they'll badge in, but they won't actually, they'll go home after they badge in and they'll badge back out, which is already happening. Or maybe they'll reverse the rules. So, we've got a lot of that same thing too. There are some companies that are exceptional and they're doing it with data. They're doing it, by saying, okay, did this work? okay, I think we could have been better. So let's try this. They're experimental, and let's do it in a pilot kind of thing. Atlassian is one of the companies that really stands out. They've got kind of an open hybrid policy, but they spend a lot of money on creating that sense of belonging, creating a culture. We've somehow come to believe that the pictures on the wall in your office are what define culture. Culture is intrinsic. That stuff's all extrinsic. And so, you've really got to get to that personal level. There's a lot of private sector companies, but that are doing it well, but they really are the exception. And they really are taking it. Leadership is acting differently, and they're walking the walk. And this is the most important thing. Without leadership buy-in, it's just not going to work. The leaders have to walk the walk. They really have to believe it. And when they make announcements, if they're going to reverse their policy, make them with, okay, we're going to try something new, or this didn't work, and this is why. This is why we need you to do something. Have good reasons, and people will follow you. Better yet, involve them in the decisions.
Yeah. Well, and
And
we
so
did get
that's what a
a
lot of the
question in the chat specifically about the Amazon situation, and the question was, are some of these return to office mandates just a version of a soft layoff?
Exactly. And that's been true since before the pandemic. The University of Pittsburgh did a study just last year, and they found that there's a strong correlation between companies that have financial problems or other problems and those that do a return to office. We saw it with Facebook. We saw it with this is way before the pandemic. IBM. We saw it with Best Buy. All were deeply troubled companies. And so, if you want people to come back, if you tell people they're going to come back, who's going to move back to the central office when they've already moved away? It's not going to be your older, more expensive employees. It's going to be your younger, more flexible employees. So you get rid of that big salary. What many people missed in that Amazon announcement was that they're also going to cut the ratio of managers to employees.
Good luck with
Okay,
that.
so I guess we are trying to get rid of people.
It's called quiet firing. And guess what? The tech industry has been plagued by what's called fake work. Who hasn't, But I mean, seriously, our whole model of work is trying to fit this square peg in a round hole of the industrial age concept of having to put in at least 8.5 hours. And, our civil service is the same because it's structured around that. We have to be judicious of government time and taxpayer dollars. I get that. But there are better ways of working that can benefit even those that can't participate in remote or hybrid work and have the flexibility that they need to do their best work when it makes sense for the customer, the mission, and for their lives. I mean, we've got lives here, people. In the federal workforce, we have over 60% of our federal workers have caregiving and parental responsibilities, either one or the other or both. And so, who doesn't experience a need? And even if you don't have kids or caregiving responsibilities, I'm sure you have a life and other things that you like to do. And so just taking this human-centered approach to how we look at the work itself and create opportunity for us to grow from this continuous learning mindset is where the sweet spot is. Because let me tell you something, the hubris of thinking, oh, well, we worked this way 100% during the pandemic, we know how to do remote and hybrid, that is going to eat you alive. And so the agencies that have been benchmarking best practices or other public sector organizations who are doing really well with engagement scores and culture and outcomes and productivity as it relates to mission delivery are the ones that are going to get it right. And to identify a couple biases that plague a hybrid workplace differently than we would traditionally think. And those are things like proximity bias, recency bias, location bias that can come into play and create inequitable workplaces regardless of where you're working. So by thinking whose voice is in the room, if I'm only interacting with Jeff, Jason, and Kate on a frequent basis, even if it's in a remote capacity, who am I missing? I'm delegating work to you all because I work with you all the time. But what about the other people that don't have the benefit of high level, high priority work and getting access to your senior leadership and visibility and, shadowing and mentoring opportunities? So that's where those inequities can come into play across a hybrid workplace, and being really aware from a neuro leadership perspective of the kinds of hybrid biases that can come into play, and then helping your workforce understand that we all have a part to play. It's not just supervisors and managers that have a responsibility for getting this right. It's part because they lead people, but every one of us have to be responsible, and we have to be accessible, and we have to be working when we're working.
I think to that end, I love the way Mika set all that up. The whole conversation about ensuring that people feel seen, valued, and heard means we have got to take time with one another. The Surgeon General last year issued an advisory on loneliness and isolation. One of our clients is Boston Children's Hospital, the cardiologist, 100 best cardiologists in the world, 3 years to take an appointment with them. And they're saying they're seeing more cardiovascular disease in younger people because of this whole concept of loneliness and isolation. So we've got to spend time seeing and hearing one another. And an operational suggestion that I think almost any agency can utilize in order to see a more hybrid engaged workplace and workforce is that when you do have a hybrid meeting, instead of the 8 people around the table leading the meeting, identifying who says what next, you kick it over to the folks that are online, that are remote, and they actually lead the meeting from a remote capacity. What does that do? To Mika's point, it reduces proximity bias. And it lets people know, not only do I see you and I hear you, but I'm including you to be the leader that I've asked you to be. Because our normalized capacity, particularly in agencies where the technology is, let's just say, wonky at best, is I will participate, but my presence isn't full. Because I'm a good government worker. I got 2 screens, maybe I got 3 screens. So I'm looking at you, Jason, but I'm not really seeing you, because what I'm really doing is I'm doing emails on the side and saying I'm fully present. The greatest gift that a senior leader can do is being present with their employees and asking questions from a curiosity point of view. We've got to replace blame with curiosity, be fully present with folks, and then finally just experience this crazy thing called acknowledgement and praise, where we can give folks shout outs just because they're present, they're doing work, and we appreciate who they are.
And
You made the point about, we've been talking.
Too. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kate, you go.
We've been talking about inclusion. There's so much opportunity in remote for inclusion. When the pandemic first happened, the people that were virtual before, that were remote before, found that now they felt more included. And if you think about the workplace, it's designed for extroverts. And by having kind of a level playing field, even early on when you're seeing the CEO, sitting in the chair with his dog walking past, that sort of humanized people. But the ability to hear from people, to give them different avenues for talking, and look at the chat column here. I'm like, I want to just read it all. That's people that are conversing that maybe would not have been willing to jump into a meeting. People that think more slowly, people that don't speak English as a first language. All of those people get a new way to say, if you start thinking about asynchronous documents, for example. That study that I mentioned earlier, we found that 70% of people think you could replace more than a quarter of meetings with email or recorded meetings. I mean, everybody hates meetings. And so by giving them an asynchronous document, I can take the time as an introvert and think about what I'm going to say. Introverts aren't blurters. We don't just blurt something out and, let's just all talk it out. But I can be thoughtful, and then I can, and as things come to me later, I have a new way of participating in this thought pool.
Oh, thanks so much. I'm trying to listen, manage the chat, watch the Q&A. One thing that we are going to shift to audience Q&A, although we have been integrating it just into the flow of our conversation. So Really appreciate everyone out there engaging with one another, sharing what's going on in your organization. And one thing that I have seen throughout the chat and the conversation this morning is um, there's a huge burden for management in particular around navigating accommodations and navigating everybody's own personal life situation. And some people commented that we're spending all of our time on that we're not actually doing the work that we are supposed to be here doing. um, I'm curious, Mika or Jeff, if you're seeing or feeling or hearing this out there, and if so, what are your recommendations for folks who find themselves in that situation?
Do you want me to go first, Jeff? And
Sure.
then, okay. Well, I want to talk about reasonable accommodations, because what happens when we try to create mandates and universal approaches by clamping down and making it even more restrictive for all is that people who otherwise wouldn't have to request an accommodation for their lives because of more flexible approaches to policy implementation are now having to go through a formal process of accommodating their needs. And that is an administrative burden for the EO staff, for managers and supervisors, and for HR to take that approach. It's costing the taxpayer a lot of dollars when it comes to that as well. And so, as much as we can accommodate with a flexible approach to work, but also thinking through the lens of like, what are the moments that matter most for us to be together from a work perspective? Is it access to specialized equipment if you're working in a skiff, or need access to JWICs if you have a clearance? Is it time for us to build in connection time while we're innovating and solving problems? Maybe there's an opportunity to do that because there is a need and a purpose for bringing people together in a fashion that they feel like they are connected and included. But guess what? Life happens. And so it's ultimately going to happen. Someone's going to get sick, or their child's sick, or some medical emergency happens, or the planes are delayed. And so, how do we create space for that while also accommodating that flexible approach? I think we need to think differently altogether. So, some of the agencies that are doing this really well have policies in place that are complying with the OMB mandates of trying to get to that 50% in office. But like, I have changed their policy approach to say, we're going to require people to come in during core office hours on their in-office days. And at the team level, they're making agreements that, like, because of these purposes, let's try to make sure that we're together on Tuesday and Thursday if it's 2 days a week. And then you'll have the flexibility outside of core hours to take your unclassified or independent asynchronous work home. You won't be able to account your commuting time because that's your choice. You can choose to do it in the office, or you could choose to finish your full workday in the office, or you could choose to finish it from your home office. But if you choose to do it, you have that choice. And what workers want most of all is trust, autonomy, and the ability to have a choice in the flexible work. Like you said, public servants are very committed to the mission. They're very loyal. They know what they need to have done, unless you didn't tell them. So I just think, like, taking a flexible approach, but also put those accountability measures and thinking about better ways for creating space to be together when you have to be together, but give flexibility when you don't.
Yeah, I'd echo the thoughts on intentionality. And and I love the way Kate said earlier, there's opportunity here, right? There's opportunity to create different kinds of training engagements where we're letting people learn, grow, and experience the knowledge exchange that's so important in agencies. As we know, in every agency, as much as they want to say it, knowledge management isn't written down and available on the internet. In fact, if you think it from a generational perspective, you're working with a baby boomer when that individual has piles of papers and you have to kind of do a salsa dance to walk through their office, right? Because oftentimes knowledge is perceived as power. And so one of the things that we have to do in that capacity is we really have to focus on information equity. Going back to Amazon, something that Jeff Bezos has implemented, we could consider in the government, is that rather than have 5 or 6 different pre-meetings, right? We're going to be talking about a subject. And so the 4 of us are meeting together. What, say Jason is our leader, his responsibility would be to give us a 1-pager that we all get when we arrive at the meeting, And the first 10 or 15 minutes, we read the one pager. Why is that? Because we're all getting the same information at the same time and can now execute based on our experience and our different levels of engagement. Information equity is causing stress, or the lack of it is causing stress for a lot of folks who are working in a hybrid capacity, because something could be passed out in a meeting room. I didn't even know what it was. Two people are having a conversation as a sidebar. Did something else pop up? When we focus on we got to be more tactical, right? If we're going to ask people to be producing in this new world of work, we got to give them the tools, let them know what the expectations are, then celebrate their successes in a way that makes sense. You know, the Federal Executive Institute for 35 plus years looks at emotional intelligence. And you know, that scale goes from 70 to 140. What's the average scale of a federal leader with respect to emotional intelligence? Pick your poison, put in the chat, whatever you think it is. A couple numbers will run. 70 to 140. It's 81. So we're asking people to function as leaders, noticing a person's capacity when they're online. How do I know when they're disengaged? And what's my responsibility and my opportunity? I love the way Kate talked about that. What's my opportunity to re-engage that person? That pivots us back to the same concept. We got to be able to train them. And then in that training, let them make some mistakes. They're going to learn and grow. And then walk ourselves with some care, compassion, tenderness, that you may have made a mistake, but you're not a mistake. You were called to be a leader in this agency. Your contribution matters. And the people you are leading, they need to see your best self.
Thanks, Jeff. Kate, do you want to respond there, or respond and address a question that we're seeing from the audience around kind of outcome-based management? You know, how do we actually focus our workforce on what's most important, and how might that aid in paying attention to what matters at work most?
Yeah, I mean, it's about setting goals and having measurable goals, setting outcomes. You know, let's look at someone that's doing maybe software development, writing code or something like that. We could say something like, "Oh, well, he writes more code than she writes." Well, is his code better? Is it more concise? Do we have fewer help calls as a result of the same thing with a help desk? You know, I could talk to you for 20 minutes, but we may just be talking about the weather. Or I could answer your call in 2 minutes and you'd have to call back 3 other times because it wasn't really a good answer. And so, you know, it really has to start at the top of the organization and the goals of the organization, and then come down to the individuals that make up that team to achieve what the organization wants to achieve. So it's, you know, it's about working together to understand what are we really trying to achieve, what's important and what isn't important. How do we prioritize these things? Because, you know, a lot of times it just seems like everything's a priority. And, you know, I'm a big believer in getting all the crap out of the way that keeps us from being productive. I keep seeing the word meetings come up in the in the chat here. I mean, they're crap. We're just not doing meetings well. A top-rated meeting in this survey we did was valued by only 24%. Indicated that it was valuable to only 24% of people. That was the top rated meeting. And that was a meeting where, you know, decisions were being made. Status updates were like rated valuable by about 2% of people.
Right. Because status updates should be shared asynchronously instead of in a meeting.
Exactly. You don't have to have people in a room. You can record the meeting so we can watch it later, especially with the, you know, people working across time zones. Who really needs to be there? I mean, well, the first question is, does this need to be a meeting anyway? Question every time you have a meeting, does this need to be a meeting? What do we expect to achieve out of it? Did we achieve that? Have everybody rate the meeting. I love doing this. Rate the meeting at the end. And you know, around a lot of things, around inclusion, around what was decided, you know, just we've got to start looking at everything with a new lens of, you know, we've got to stop wasting time and we've got to start prioritizing results. What are the outcomes we're trying to achieve, and back up from there. What is it? What is it we need to do that? Do we need training? Do we need better equipment? Do we need better leadership? All of those things.
Yeah, no, I love this, and I'm seeing in the chat and in our Q&A tab that folks really like these kind of tactical and practical suggestions. Like, what can you do? What are some things that you've seen work? One question that came up was, just other ways to focus on that, whether it's that organizational effectiveness or the culture, building culture that we really want in our organization that lets people participate and bring their full selves to work.
Yeah, the GitLab is one of the largest all virtual companies in the world. And I think they've got maybe a couple thousand employees. Nobody goes to the office. Nobody is even interviewed in person. And they're a very, very successful company. And one of the things they do, I've talked to some of the leaders about it. One of the things they do is at each meeting, they say, this is the purpose of the meeting. This is how it ties to our values. And this is, it's painted on the wall behind them. It's just this constant reminder of this is what we stand for. And the repetition of this is what we value. And this is why this meeting is important to that. And this is why you in your job is important to that and what you can do to be helpful.
Yeah, I would add it. I think it's really critical that there's discussion around new workplace norms. So what is the norm? And in fact, even a meeting, whether it's remote, in person, or hybrid. Here's a big one that we see pop up a lot with organizations we work with. What's the norm when you have to get a hold of your leader? And yesterday we were all in the office. Well, if their door was closed and they were talking to somebody else, I knew they were not technically available. But today, the green light is the green light, right? If it's on, well, what does that mean? And so when you're building individual relationships, building relationships with a team, performance management, leadership and professional development, what are the workplace norms that you are aware of? And is it you're aware of it? Maybe someone else isn't, which means that it's not a fully articulated norm. Here's what you get to do. Because you want tactical steps. If you're an individual contributor, you get to ask the question around meetings, management projects, building individual relationships, etc. And have your leadership team obviously weigh in on it. If you're a leader, invite other people to be part of the conversation to say, you know what should our norm be in this area? And why is that so important? Because in a multi-generational workplace, you're going to be onboarding people to the world of work and not just work. And we have to do it in a way that makes sense for who? For both the employee and for the leader, and ultimately for the agency and the mission. If you don't dialogue about it, if you aren't curious about it, then you're going to be led by past practice, which may have worked, but there's possibly a better and more effective and efficient way to do it going forward.
Yeah, I wrote this in the comments. That's what's so indicative of the lack of training. We should have team norms, communication norms, meeting norms, and they should be universally adopted so that these things aren't questions, that we know how we're supposed to reach Jason, or that we shouldn't be calling Jason at 8 o'clock at night, or that we shouldn't be expecting a response to an email that came in at midnight to somebody in a different time zone. These kinds of things need to be decided, written down, and agreed upon at the team level.
Amen moment. Hallelujah moment. Yes.
And the thing is, this could be a team sport. This can be an engagement activity.
Absolutely.
And guess what? In your one-on-ones, you could just do a check-in. How is our team charter doing? Or how is our team agreement? Or what about those meetings that we decided to cancel and shift to asynchronous status updates, and we're reducing our team check-in from 60 minutes to 40 minutes or 25 minutes. How's that working for you, Kate? Jeff, how do you feel about the team agreements that we came up with? Or by the way, hey, I noticed that you're not adhering to our team agreement. Is there a reason? And if you don't, guess what's going to happen? So like coming up with these ways of normalizing asking ourselves, are we working the best way that we could be working? What are we learning from yesterday that we can apply to tomorrow? And how can we create a better workplace for us all? It involves everyone. You don't have to solve all the problems, supervisors and managers for your team. Invite them, ask them which meetings need to have video on versus video off. Can we agree that we're going to move again from a 30-minute meeting or a 60-minute meeting to a 45-minute meeting or a 25-minute meeting? And for meetings where we don't have to collaborate and share our screen, could we do a good old-fashioned walk and talk for those people that want to get some sunshine on our face, some fresh air, move around, take a brain break? I mean, my goodness, shocker. We are humans. We are allowed to have breaks, and meeting to meeting to meeting is killing us. Zoom fatigue. There's research, neuroscientists have shown that people who spend more than even just 16 hours a week in back-to-back meetings, 3/4 of them experience fatigue, exhaustion, and workplace stress.
Something
And
that just
unmanaged workplace
transformed.
stress turns into burnout. Yeah.
Yeah. Something that just transformed my working life was I use an app called Calendly, where people can, book a meeting with me, and I only offer them 20, 40, and 50-minute meetings.
Yeah.
And it's surprising how respectful people will be. Like if
Yeah.
you know somebody that's trying to sell me something, that they'll book a 20-minute meeting. But that means that I've always got that 10 minutes extra to just go to the bathroom,
Exactly. And you
to
control
get
that.
something to eat.
And you control that. Someone's asking too, Kate, talk more about what asynchronous updates could look like. So that could look like if I need something, let's say I get a tasker from the secretary and there's a deadline, maybe I record it in a PowerPoint, or I just record myself and send you a message and say, hey, Teresa, could you get back to me by the end of the day? And I'm not putting you on the spot to give me an answer right now. Just got a tasker from the congressional office. We need to provide updates by this date, time and date. Could you please get back to me? And oh, by the way, here's a link to the document for background information. Here's a link to a shared document where we're going to put brainstorming ideas on. And then let's get together for 5 minutes at the end of the day rather than 20 or 50 or an hour. And also, can we record meeting notes and share them with people who couldn't come to the live meeting? That way we are not accidentally excluding people from information, as Jeff was saying, information equity, because let me tell you something, exclusion activates pain receptors in the brain when you feel excluded from your team, from your organization, and that affects productivity and performance and engagement too. So we have a lot of ideas and suggestions amongst us. It would be fun to do a part 2, Jason. If maybe you can ask them if they want to weigh in and see, or rate the meeting and let us know. Because we're missing one of the experts from the OMB telework memo that we all contributed to, and that's Brian Elliott. It would be fun to bring him too.
Yeah, no, we're almost at time, and this has been a super robust conversation, and we obviously have only scratched the surface. We didn't get into things like, well, the union contract says that that employee doesn't have to respond to my email in 48 hours or turn on their camera ever. And what am I supposed to do about that as a manager? How the heck do I create team norms in a situation like that where I've been neutered in such a way? Or I'm afraid that OMB or the IG is going to come find that I am not complying with the plans of the big boss. But folks, do let us know and help me in giving our expert panel a round of applause and cheers. This is something that we're all learning together. And the faster we can walk together into doing work better in a modern way, the more you can focus on the reason that you all are signed up as federal employees, focusing on your mission, serving the public, doing the things, and not trapped in hopeless meetings that go on forever for spurious purposes. But let us know at Fed Manager how we can continue to be a resource on this. I'm sure that all of our experts would love to hear from you and talk with you and your organization. If they can be of help, all of us are really active on LinkedIn, and I'm on there learning from experts and leaders every day. So look up, look around, see what's going on out there. better or worse, all of us are figuring this out together. We can go faster, working with one another, sharing information. And I'll just say thanks again for the awesome conversation. Thanks again to our expert panel. We will save this chat. We'll save the questions that came in, and we'll see what we might be able to do, whether it's on a potential part 2, follow-up resources, etc. But Mika, Kate, Jeff, everyone out there, thanks so much for being with us today, and hope you have an awesome rest of the week.
Great conversation, guys.
Thank you very much. Awesome.